She arrived with nothing. She left with everything. The town of Harrow Creek laughed when a heavy-set woman dragged herself through the dust with a recipe book and a worn-out sack. They said she'd be gone by sundown. They said Blackthorn Ranch was already dead. They said a woman like her had no place in a man's world. They were wrong about all of it. Because while everyone watched the ranch collapse and assumed it was drought and misfortune, Evelyn Hart was watching something else entirely. She was watching the man who was killing it. If this story grips you from the first word, hit that like button right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, settle in, because this is going to be a long, unforgettable ride. The wagon gave out on a Tuesday. Evelyn Hart knew it the moment she heard the crack. A sound like a gunshot, splitting the dry morning air, sharp and final. The kind of sound that doesn't leave room for argument. The left rear wheel had shattered clean off the axle, and the whole wagon lurched sideways with a groan that seemed almost human, like something that had been holding itself together through sheer will and had simply decided it was done. She sat there for a moment in the tilted cab, her hands still gripping the reins, the horse snorting and stamping against the cracked earth. Then, slowly, she climbed down. The land around her was merciless. The Texas frontier in the summer of 1884 offered no sympathy to travelers. The sun sat low and flat on the horizon, like a burning coin pressed against the sky, and the road ahead shimmered with heat that made the air itself look broken. Dust rose in thin spirals from nothing, stirred by a wind so dry it cracked lips and stung eyes. There were no trees within sight, no water, no movement anywhere except the distant circling of a hawk that regarded the situation with the complete indifference of something that could simply fly away from it. Evelyn stood beside the ruined wagon and assessed the damage the way she assessed everything. Quietly, completely, without panic. The wheel was beyond repair. The nearest town, Harrow Creek, was 6 miles back, and somewhere ahead, according to the hand-drawn map she'd been given by a farmer's wife in Abilene, was Blackthorn Ranch, the only place within 40 miles advertising for a cook. She untied her horse, stroked its dusty nose once, and made the only decision that made sense. She walked. She was 24 years old, broad-shouldered and full-figured, with dark auburn hair pinned back beneath a sun-bleached bonnet, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent their lives being underestimated and have decided to make use of it. She carried a battered leather satchel over one arm and, cradled against her chest like something precious, a book, thick, dog-eared, its cover worn to a soft grey from years of handling. Her mother's recipe book, the only inheritance she'd ever received. She had come from Beaumont, Texas, with $17, a change of clothes, and the stubborn belief that a woman who could cook, who could truly cook, not just survive on salt pork and hardtack, but actually create something out of dust and dried beans and imagination, was worth something in this world. The road disagreed with her. The road offered rocks and heat and silence and the distant, indifferent circling of that hawk. She walked anyway. Harrow Creek materialized out of the haze 2 hours later, not from behind her as she'd expected, but to her right, a cluster of wooden buildings pressed together along a single main street, the kind of town that had sprung up because it had to, rather than because anyone particularly wanted it there. A livery stable. A general store with a faded awning. A sheriff's office with a crooked star nailed above the door. A saloon that had more noise coming out of it than a Tuesday morning had any business producing. Evelyn hadn't planned to stop, but her canteen was empty, and the sun had climbed to a position in the sky that felt personal, like it had selected her specifically for punishment. She pushed open the door of Whitmore's general store and stepped inside. The cool dimness was a mercy. She stood for a moment just inside the door, letting her eyes adjust, breathing in the smell of flour and tobacco and something sweetly chemical she couldn't immediately name. "Help you?" The man behind the counter was thin and angular, with a mustache that looked like it was trying to escape his face. He was looking at her in the particular way that Evelyn had grown accustomed to, that quick, involuntary assessment that moved from her face to her figure to her worn boots and back again, arriving at a conclusion before she'd spoken a single word. "Water, please," she said. "And directions to Blackthorn Ranch, if you have them." The mustache twitched. "Blackthorn?" He said the name like it tasted strange. "You got business out there?" "I'm applying for the cook's position." The sound that came out of the man was somewhere between a laugh and a cough. He turned to call toward the back of the store. "Martha, come hear this." A woman appeared from behind a curtained doorway, rounder than the man, with shrewd eyes and hair pinned in a way that suggested she took great personal pride in it. She looked Evelyn up and down with the focused efficiency of someone appraising livestock. "This woman here says she's going to Blackthorn for the cook position," the man said. "That right," Martha said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am," Evelyn said. "Boone's been through 3 cooks in 4 months," Martha said, folding her arms across her chest. 2 quit, and 1 ended up in the infirmary after she tried to move a cast-iron pot by herself. Ranch is barely running as it is. Drought's got everything dying out there. You sure you want to walk into that?" "I'm sure I want the water," Evelyn said. "The rest I'll decide when I get there." Another beat of silence. Then Martha Whitmore reached beneath the counter and set a tin cup of water on the wooden surface. "Ranch is 3 miles northwest, once you hit the fork past the cottonwood grove. Can't miss the gate. Got a black iron thorn on it, hence the name." She paused, studying Evelyn with those shrewd eyes. "You're walking?" "My wagon broke down." "In this heat?" "Yes, ma'am." Martha looked at her for a long moment, long enough that the thin man behind the counter shifted uncomfortably, as though the silence required filling. Martha didn't fill it. She went into the back and came out with a biscuit wrapped in cloth and a filled canteen. She set them on the counter without a word. Evelyn reached for her coin purse, but the woman shook her head. "You're either going to make it or you're not," Martha said. "Either way, nobody should starve on the road." It was the kindest thing anyone in Harrow Creek would say to her for quite some time. The iron gate was exactly where Martha had said it would be. Black and slightly crooked, with a thorned design worked into the metal that had once probably been striking and now just looked tired. Beyond it, a road of packed earth wound toward a cluster of buildings set against a low ridge. The ranch itself was larger than Evelyn had expected, a main house of weathered timber, 2-storied, with a porch that ran the full length of its front. Behind it, several outbuildings, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse that looked like it hadn't seen smoke in some time, a barn, and a network of fenced enclosures that stretched toward the ridge. In the distance, she could see cattle, fewer than the fencing suggested there should be, and standing with the low-headed stillness of animals that were not well. She pushed through the gate and walked toward the main house. She was nearly at the porch steps when a voice came from the side of the barn. "Ranch isn't taking visitors?" The man who stepped out was perhaps 35, though the sun had added years to him that a kinder climate might have spared. Tall, broad in the shoulders, with dark hair under a sweat-stained hat, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved with something blunt. He wore no expression that she could read, just a flat, watchful stillness, the way a man looks when he's been disappointed too many times to arrange his face into anticipation. "I'm not a visitor," Evelyn said. "I'm here about the cook position, Evelyn Hart from Beaumont." He looked at her. The same assessment she'd received from the Whitmores, but different in quality, less contemptuous and more simply thorough, like he was calculating something. "Silas Boone," he said finally. "I own this ranch." He didn't move toward her or offer his hand. "The position's been open since May. AAD's been running in 3 papers. You're the first to come in person." "I wasn't able to ride ahead," she said. "My situation changed quickly." "Where'd you come from today?" "Left the main road about 3 miles east. Wagon wheel broke." Something shifted in his expression. Not sympathy exactly, but a slight recalibration. "You walked 3 miles in this heat?" "I did." He looked at her boots, her dust-covered dress, the canteen at her hip, the satchel and the book pressed against her side. He looked at all of this the way a man looks at evidence rather than a person. "What do you know about ranch cooking?" he asked. "Everything that matters," she said. "I can feed a crew of 20 on short supplies and make it taste like there's plenty. I can preserve, I can cure, I can bake, I can stretch a side of beef across a week without anyone complaining. I've cooked in logging camps and on a steamboat and in a boarding house that had more guests than budget. I know how to work a kitchen under difficult conditions." She waited. "That's quite a list," Boone said. "I can back it up." Another silence. The sun pressed down on them both with equal indifference. "I've got 12 ranch hands," he said at last. "Breakfast before sunup, lunch packed for the field, dinner before dark. Kitchen's been unmanned for 6 weeks, pantry's not in good shape. Pay is $8 a month with room and board." 10, Evelyn said. His eyes narrowed slightly. 9. 9.5, she said, and I want Sundays free afternoon. Something that might have been the ghost of amusement crossed his face and vanished almost immediately. You can start today, he said. We'll see how dinner goes. The kitchen was a disaster, not through malice, but through the specific entropy that takes hold when a space is abandoned by anyone who cares about it. Pots unwashed and stacked unevenly, the iron range filmed with grease, flour spilled and dried into a cement-like layer across half the work surface, a pantry that held half-empty sacks in uncertain condition, and canned goods with no organization Evelyn could detect. She stood in the doorway for exactly 30 seconds, taking it all in. Then she put her satchel on a hook by the door, tied on her apron, and got to work. The ranch hands came in for dinner at sundown to find the kitchen transformed. Not perfectly, not yet, but fundamentally. The range was lit and hot, the surfaces scrubbed to raw wood, the pots gleaming. And from the stovetop rose a smell that stopped every man in the doorway. "That's," a young hand named Pete Dawson started. "Beef stew," Evelyn said without turning from the pot. "Cornbread in the oven, dried apple compote for dessert. Sit down." They sat. 12 men ranging in age from Pete's 17 to a leathery veteran named Cal Reardon, who'd been riding range since before half of them were born. They sat, and they looked at the food placed before them. And then they ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable, but rather the particular silence of people encountering something better than they'd expected. Cal Reardon set down his spoon after the third bite and looked toward the kitchen. "Ma'am," he called, "this stew." "Yes? Where'd you find the time?" Evelyn looked up from the bread she was slicing. Back corner of the pantry, behind the salt barrel, there was a whole dried bunch of it that nobody had touched. The old man nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something. "Previous cook said we didn't have any." "Previous cook wasn't looking hard enough," Evelyn said pleasantly. Silas Boone ate at the end of the table, apart from the others in the way of a man who has learned that authority requires a certain distance. He said nothing through the meal, but when he rose to leave, he paused at the kitchen doorway. "Dinner was acceptable," he said. Coming from a man who spoke with the economy of someone who'd been charged by the word, Evelyn understood this for what it was. "Thank you, Mr. Boone," she said. He left. She smiled at the cornbread pan. Acceptable was a start. She noticed the water on her third day. It was early morning before the hands were up, the sky still grey with pre-dawn, and the air cool enough to be almost forgiving. Evelyn had risen at 4 to start the breakfast fire, and she'd filled the large kettle from the pump at the kitchen sink. She filled a tin cup to taste it the way she always did in a new kitchen. It was a habit her mother had taught her. Know your water, Evie. Water tells you everything about a place. She drank a mouthful, set the cup down, drank again, slowly this time. There was something, barely there, at the back of the throat. Not exactly bitter, not exactly metallic. Something mineral in a way that the natural minerality of well water didn't quite account for. She poured the cup out, filled it again, tasted again. Same thing. She said nothing about it that morning. She needed more information before she said anything at all. By the end of her first week, she had catalogued a list of small wrongnesses that she kept in a notebook, tucked inside her mother's recipe book, written in the same small, careful hand she used for measurements. Well water off, with a slight aftertaste that wasn't natural. 2 steers near the barn, standing apart from the herd and not drinking. A flour sack tied with a different knot than the ranch standard. A feed inventory that didn't match what Cal said had been delivered the previous month. A difference of approximately 200 pounds of grain. She watched, and she noted, and she said nothing yet. Because Evelyn Hart had learned, in 24 years of being underestimated by almost everyone she encountered, that the moment a woman like her said something is wrong here, every man in the room would explain to her patiently why she was mistaken. Evidence, then. She needed evidence that couldn't be explained away. At the end of her second week, she asked Cal Reardon if he'd walk her to the second pasture. Cal was 50-something, quiet in the particular way of men who'd been everywhere and seen most things. And he'd been watching Evelyn with the careful attention of someone trying to figure out what category she fit into. He'd settled, apparently, on worth paying attention to. "Why the second pasture?" he asked. "I want to see the cattle." He looked at her. "You're a cook." "I'm a cook who likes to know what she's working with," she said. "Humour me." They walked out in the slant of late afternoon light, the dry grass crackling underfoot. The herd was gathered in the far corner near the water trough, and Evelyn studied them without pretending she knew more than she did. She wasn't a cattle woman, but she'd cooked for enough ranch crews to know what healthy range cattle look like. These animals were wrong in ways that drought alone didn't explain. Too many standing with their heads low, hides dull, several visibly underweight in a way that suggested not just poor grazing, but something affecting their ability to utilize what they ate. "How long have they been like this?" she asked. Cal was quiet for a moment. "Started noticing about 4 months back. Boss thinks it's the drought. Less grass, less water, less weight. Makes sense on its face." "Does it match what you've seen in other droughts?" Another pause, longer this time. "Not exactly. I've seen drought cattle. They get thin, sure, but they don't usually get dull like this. These animals look..." He searched for the word. "Confused." Evelyn crouched at the edge of the trough and looked at the water's surface. There was a faint discoloration at the bottom, barely visible, a slight greenish-grey tinge to the sediment. She took out her notebook and wrote the date and what she saw. Then she stood and looked at Cal directly. He was a man who deserved directness. "I'm thinking, she said, that this ranch isn't dying from the drought." She met Victor Crow on a Friday when he rode into Blackthorn with 2 of his men and a smile that fit his face the way a well-tailored jacket fits a man, perfectly, expensively, designed to make an impression. He was perhaps 50, with silver hair worn long enough to suggest vanity, and a mustache maintained with a precision that indicated he had both the time and the inclination. His clothes were better than good for a working rancher, which told Evelyn something immediately. He wore his wealth the way some men wore weapons, openly, as a statement. He tied his horse at the post and walked to where Silas was speaking with 2 hands near the barn, and the transformation in his manner as he approached was something Evelyn, watching from the kitchen window, found deeply interesting. He became warmer, more solicitous, the smile deepening into something that looked almost like genuine concern. "Silas," he said, gripping the rancher's hand with both of his. "I heard things are getting harder out here. Wanted to come by myself, see how you're holding up." Silas received this with his characteristic stillness. "We're managing, Victor." "Of course you are." The tone was admiring and somehow subtly sad. The tone of a man praising someone's courage in the face of an outcome he privately considers inevitable. "Though I have to say, the offer still stands. If things get to a point where you want to discuss a sale..." "They won't," Silas said. Crow raised his hands in a gesture of pure conciliation. Of course. Just want you to know you have options, that's all." He looked around at the ranch with the gaze of a man doing arithmetic. Then his eyes found the kitchen window, and found Evelyn there. For just a moment his expression did something complicated. "New cook?" he asked. "Evelyn Hart," Silas said. "Started 2 weeks ago." Crow looked at her for another beat. Something in his face had gone very neutral, very managed, the way a man's face goes when he is deciding what to show. "Hope she works out for you," he said pleasantly, and turned his attention back to Silas. Evelyn stepped back from the window. She wrote the name Victor Crow in her notebook, and beneath it a single observation. He looked at me like he was calculating whether I was a problem. 3 weeks into her time at Blackthorn, Evelyn found the ledgers. She hadn't been looking for them exactly. She'd needed the record of last month's supply delivery to verify the grain discrepancy, and she'd followed that thread to the ranch office, a small room off the main hall that smelled of old paper and the particular dusty sadness of problems that had been avoided for too long. She found the delivery record, and then, because the column next to it didn't match what she was expecting, she looked at the column beside that one, and the one before. And then she found herself sitting on the floor of the office with 6 months of ledgers spread around her, following a trail of numbers that didn't add up no matter how many times she added them. The pattern was there once you saw it, hidden in the ordinary fluctuations of a struggling ranch, costs rising, revenues falling, supplies disappearing at rates that could be attributed to drought and waste and simple misfortune. But the rate was wrong, too consistent, too evenly distributed across too many categories for natural loss. She heard boots on the porch and gathered the ledgers quickly, returning them to their positions before the office door opened. Silas Boone stood in the doorway looking at her. "What are you doing in here?" he asked. Not angry, but not angry either. "I was looking for the supply delivery record from last month," she said. "I needed to check something about the grain inventory. I apologize for not asking first." He looked at her, then at the ledgers on the shelf, then back at her. "What did you need to check?" he asked slowly. She looked at him for a moment, this quiet, battle-worn man standing in the doorway of his own failing ranch, carrying the weight of something he didn't fully understand. She thought about all the ways this could go. And then she made a decision. "Mr. Boone," she said carefully, "I've been noticing things since I arrived. Small things on their own, but together." She stopped. "May I sit down with you? There are some questions I'd like to ask you." He stared at her for a long, still moment. "Close the door," he said, and took a seat behind the desk. She asked her questions. He answered them, reluctantly at first, then with increasing directness as he seemed to realize she was following a logic he hadn't considered. She asked about the well, the feed deliveries, the finances, not the headline numbers, but the detailed columns, the small, regular expenses that accumulated into catastrophe. When she finished, the room was quiet. "You think someone is doing this deliberately?" Silas said. "I think it's possible," she said carefully. "I don't have enough yet to be certain, but the pattern, the water, the cattle, the grain, the finances, it doesn't feel like bad luck, Mr. Boone. Bad luck doesn't have a pattern." He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. She could see something moving through him, not quite anger, not quite grief. More like the internal reckoning of a man understanding that he had been blaming himself for a disaster he hadn't caused. "What do you need?" he finally asked. "Time," she said, "and access, and your trust that I won't say a word of this to anyone until I'm sure." He looked at her again with those flat, careful eyes. "You walked 3 miles in the August heat on a broken road to apply for a cook's job," he said. "I figure you're not someone who does things without a reason." "No," she agreed. "I'm not." Another silence, the kind that precedes something that matters. "You have my trust, Miss Hart," he said quietly. "Don't make me regret it." The investigation had begun, and somewhere beyond the Black Iron Gate, across the parched and dying frontier, the men who had been hunting Blackthorn Ranch were still hunting, entirely unaware that for the first time, someone was hunting back. The days that followed Evelyn's conversation with Silas Boone settled into a rhythm that looked, from the outside, entirely ordinary. She rose before dawn. She lit the range. She fed 12 men 3 times a day and kept the kitchen running with the quiet competence of someone who had learned long ago that usefulness was its own form of armor. But beneath that surface, beneath every routine task and every pleasant exchange over the breakfast table, Evelyn Hart was working. She had started a second notebook. The first held recipes, her mother's handwriting layered beneath her own additions, years of accumulated knowledge pressed between worn covers. The second was newer, its pages still stiff, and it held something entirely different: dates, observations, questions with no answers yet. A map, hand-drawn and imprecise, of the ranch's layout and the locations of every anomaly she'd identified. She kept it tucked inside the recipe book because nobody looked twice at a cook carrying a recipe book. She began with the water. The morning after her conversation with Silas, she rose an hour earlier than usual and took 3 separate water samples, from the kitchen pump, from the stock trough near the barn, and from a small natural spring she'd noticed at the western edge of the property during her walk with Cal. She stored them in 3 glass jars she'd cleaned and labeled, and she set them in a row on the windowsill where the morning light came through. The difference was visible by noon. The kitchen pump water and the trough water both showed the same faint discoloration settling at the bottom, that greyish-green sediment she'd noticed before. Almost nothing, the kind of thing a person would dismiss as natural mineral deposit if they weren't specifically looking. The spring water was clear, completely, unambiguously clear. She carried the jars to the office and set them on Silas's desk without a word. He looked at them for a long moment, then he looked at her. "The spring water's clean," he said. "Yes." "So whatever's in the well water isn't coming from the ground itself?" "That's my thinking," she said. "The aquifer's fine. Something is getting into the well from above, or from the pipe." Silas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It was the expression, she was learning, of a man processing anger that he had decided not to express yet. "How long do you think this has been going on? Based on how the cattle look?" She considered. "At least 3 months, maybe 4. He stood and moved to the window, looking out toward the barn and the ridge beyond it. Outside, Pete Dawson was crossing the yard with a feed bucket, moving with the easy lope of a young man who hadn't yet had enough taken from him to change the way he moved. Silas watched him in silence. "I've been blaming myself," he said quietly. Not to her exactly, more to the window, to the dry air and the failing land outside it. "I know," she said. "I thought I'd made bad decisions, expanded too fast before the drought, hired wrong, mismanaged the finances." He turned from the window. "I've been thinking about selling." "Don't," Evelyn said. The word came out more sharply than she'd intended, and she softened it slightly. "Not yet, not until we know what we're actually dealing with." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, something between gratitude and the particular wariness of a man who had learned that hope was expensive. "All right," he said, What's next?" "The feed," she said. "I want to watch the delivery process myself." The next supply delivery was scheduled for Thursday. Evelyn was in the yard when the wagon rolled in, ostensibly checking the condition of some drying herbs she'd strung from a porch beam, but positioned with a clear line of sight to the barn entrance where Cal received deliveries. She watched the entire process, the unloading, the counting, the signing of the receipt. She watched the two delivery men from Harrow Creek who handled the sacks, watched how they moved, watched the specific and deliberate inefficiency of men who were in no hurry. One of the men, younger, with a narrow face and eyes that moved too quickly, lingered near the back of the barn after the last sack was unloaded. His partner had already returned to the wagon. This man spent perhaps 40 seconds near the feed storage area before following. 40 seconds was nothing. 40 seconds was also, Evelyn noted, enough time to do something small and specific if you knew exactly what you were doing. She wrote it down. Time, description, duration. She noted the man's face well enough to describe him in detail, which was a skill she had developed over years of cooking for strangers in unfamiliar places. The ability to fix a face in memory the way some people fixed a recipe, noting its particular features with quiet precision. That evening, she found Cal Reardon sitting outside the bunkhouse in the cooling air, working a piece of leather with a small knife. She sat beside him without being invited, which was the kind of thing you could do with Cal once he'd decided you were worth paying attention to. "Tell me about the delivery men," she said. Cal kept working the leather. Harrow Creek Freight, same crew for about 4 months. "And before that?" "Before that was a man named Hicks. Retired, I heard. These two took over his route." He paused his knife. "Why?" "The young one with the narrow face," she said. "The one who does the counting. Does he always go into the back of the barn after unloading?" Cal was still for a moment. Then he set down the knife and looked at her directly. His eyes, in the evening light, were the eyes of a man who had been noticing something he hadn't let himself fully examine yet. "Now that you say it," he said slowly. "How long has the grain been coming up short?" she asked. A silence. A long one. 4 months, Cal said, give or take. They looked at each other in the fading light. Neither of them needed to say what the other was thinking. "I haven't told Silas," Cal said, and the words carried the weight of a man confessing to something. "Because I couldn't prove it. I thought maybe I was miscounting. Maybe the grain was just lighter on account of the drought. Sometimes the suppliers cut quality when supply is low." He rubbed a hand across his face. "I should have said something." "You're saying something now," Evelyn said. "That's what matters." He looked at her with an expression that was almost surprised, as though he'd expected judgment and received something else instead. "You're not what I expected," he said. "When Boone brought you on..." "Nobody is," she said simply, and stood to go back to the kitchen. She stopped after a few steps and turned. "Cal, the 2 men before me who quit, and the one who ended up in the infirmary. Do you know why they left?" Cal picked up his knife again. His voice, when he answered, was carefully even. First one said the work was too hard. Second said she had family troubles and needed to get back to Amarillo. He paused. The third one, Margaret, her name was, she said the kitchen spooked her, said she kept finding her things moved, couldn't sleep, said the ranch felt wrong. Evelyn absorbed this. "Did you believe her?" "At the time I thought she was overwrought," he glanced up. "Now I'm not so sure." She nodded and went back to the kitchen, and by the time she had the next morning's bread set to rise, she had added 3 more lines to her notebook. Someone had been running off the previous cooks. Someone who hadn't expected a woman who walked 3 miles in August heat and didn't spook easily. That realization didn't frighten her. It clarified things considerably. The trap that was closing around Blackthorn Ranch had been designed for people who gave up. Evelyn Hart had never learned how. Over the following week, she extended her investigation outward from the ranch itself and into the town of Harrow Creek, moving carefully and with patience because she understood that the moment she moved too quickly or spoke too openly, whoever was orchestrating this would simply change their methods. She began making the supply run herself once a week, which Silas agreed to with only a brief expression of surprise. Most ranchers sent hands for supply runs, not cooks, and she used those trips to listen. Harrow Creek was a small town, and small towns, in Evelyn's experience, were remarkable repositories of information. They just required the right kind of listening. Not the direct, interrogative kind that made people cautious, but the patient, receptive kind. The kind that let conversations find you while you were looking at bolts of fabric in the general store or waiting for your order at the counter. She heard the name Victor Crow frequently. More than frequently. She heard it the way you hear the name of weather, something ambient and unavoidable that shaped every other conversation without always being the subject of it. Crow owned the biggest spread in the county, the Bar C Ranch, 3 times the size of Blackthorn. He had interests in the freight company, in a lumber operation north of town, and, she learned from a carefully casual exchange with the woman who ran the hat shop, in the bank that held mortgages for half the ranching families in the county. "He's done well," Evelyn observed in the tone of mild, uninterested acknowledgement. The hat shop woman, Mrs. Aldrin, with quick eyes and a talent for conversation, tilted her head in that particular way of someone calibrating how much to say. "He has," she agreed. "Started buying land about 18 months ago, quietly at first, then less quietly." She straightened a bonnet on its stand. 3 families sold to him last year. Hendersons, the Quan brothers, the Peralta widow. She paused. All 3 had what you'd call sudden misfortunes just before they sold. Evelyn looked up from the ribbon she'd been pretending to examine. What kind of misfortunes? Cattle losses, well trouble. Financial problems that didn't quite make sense given how well they'd been doing before. Mrs. Aldrin looked at Evelyn steadily, with an expression that said she was a woman who had her own 2 eyes and used them. Interesting timing, every time. Evelyn paid for the ribbon she hadn't wanted, and walked back to her wagon with the particular controlled stillness of a woman sitting very carefully on top of something urgent. 3 families, all with the same pattern. Blackthorn was not an isolated target. Blackthorn was the current target in a systematic campaign that had already consumed 3 other ranches, that had already transferred thousands of acres from their rightful owners to Victor Crow's growing empire, and that would continue until someone stopped it. She drove back to Blackthorn with her hands steady on the reins, and her mind working at a pace that felt almost physical. That evening, instead of sitting in the kitchen after dinner as she usually did, she went to the office and found Silas going over accounts with the expression of a man looking for errors in arithmetic when the problem is in the architecture. She set her notebook on the desk in front of him, open to the page where she'd documented everything: the water samples, the feed discrepancies, the delivery man's behavior, Cal's 4-month timeline, and now the 3 other ranching families with the same pattern of manufactured decline. He read it without speaking. She watched his face move through something complicated, the recognition, the anger, the grief of a man understanding that his suffering had been deliberate. When he finished, he set the notebook down with a precision that suggested he was controlling something he didn't want to release in front of her. "Crow," he said, just the name. He's buying land across this county," she said. "Not because ranchers are failing, because he's making them fail. Then he buys for a fraction of what the land is worth, because by the time a man is watching his cattle die and his well water go bad and his finances collapse all at once, he'll take whatever someone offers him just to end it." Silas was quiet for so long that she heard the night insects start outside the window. That first tentative chorus that rose every evening when the heat finally, grudgingly, backed off a few degrees. "I almost sold," he said. 3 weeks ago, before you came. Crow made an offer. I had it in my hand, the papers I was going to sign." Evelyn felt something cold move through her at that. How close it had been. How perfectly it had been engineered. The pressure applied slowly and consistently. The deadline created by manufactured ruin. The solution conveniently offered by the very man who had built the crisis. "What stopped you?" she asked. He picked up the papers she'd laid before him, then set them down again. "Pride, mostly," he said with the honesty of a man who'd had time to think about it. "I didn't want to give him the satisfaction. I told myself I'd fight 1 more month." He looked at her. Then you walked in from the road. Neither of them said anything for a moment. We need proof, Evelyn said. What I have is pattern and circumstance. It's enough for you and me, but it's not enough to take to a sheriff or in front of a community. Crow has money and reputation and the kind of social standing that makes people explain away evidence. We need something concrete, something caught in the act. You're thinking about a trap, Silas said. I'm thinking, she said carefully, that whoever is coming onto this property to poison the feed and contaminate the well has been doing so without detection because nobody was looking for them. We change that. Silas leaned back in his chair, and in his face she could see the shift, the transition from a man defending a position to a man considering an offensive one. It changed him, made him look less worn. What do you need from me? I need you to trust me to coordinate this, she said. I need Cal, and I need you to keep behaving as though you have no idea what's happening. If Crow or his people think we're onto them, they'll pull back and change their approach and we'll lose the chance. You want me to act defeated. I want you to act exactly like a man who is close to the end of his rope, which shouldn't be too difficult, she added, with a precision that was gentle but not soft, since that's been your reality for 4 months. Something moved across his face, almost a smile, almost. It didn't quite arrive, but she could see its outline. You're a particular kind of person, Miss Hart, he said. I've been told, she replied, and picked up her notebook. At the door she paused, the same way he had paused at the kitchen door on her first night, and she thought that perhaps Blackthorn Ranch had a way of making people stop in doorways at significant moments. Mr. Boone, she said, they picked this ranch because they thought you were isolated, because they thought you had no one watching carefully enough to catch what they were doing. She looked at him steadily. They were wrong about that. As of about 3 weeks ago, they were wrong about that. She left him sitting in the lamplight with her notebook still on the desk, and she went to the kitchen and began to plan, methodically, patiently, with the same attention she brought to every difficult meal she'd ever prepared. The same knowledge that the most important thing was not to rush, not to skip steps, not to let impatience destroy what careful preparation could build. The men who were hunting Blackthorn Ranch had been at this for months. They were comfortable. They believed they were invisible. Evelyn had spent 3 weeks learning the shape of exactly what they were doing, and now she knew their pattern better than they knew she existed. She thought of the narrow-faced delivery man lingering in the back of the barn. She thought of the sediment settling in 3 glass jars on a windowsill. She thought of 3 families who had already lost what was theirs. She opened her notebook to a clean page and wrote a single word at the top, watch, and beneath that she began to write the plan. The plan required stillness above everything else, and stillness was something Evelyn had always been better at than most people expected from her. She spent 2 days doing nothing visible. She cooked, she fed the hands, she made pie on Wednesday because Pete Dawson had mentioned in passing that his mother used to make apple pie, and his face had done something young and unguarded when he said it. And Evelyn had filed that away the way she filed everything, quietly, completely, without making a production of it. She went on her Thursday supply run and said nothing of consequence to anyone. She smiled at Victor Crow's man at the freight counter and accepted her order and drove back to the ranch without varying her routine by a single detail. Beneath that surface, she was building the trap with the same patience and precision she brought to bread dough, working it slowly, letting it develop, not rushing what needed time to become what it was going to be. She spoke to Cal on Thursday evening, quietly, near the spring at the western edge of the property where the sound of running water covered conversation that she didn't want carrying on the night air. She laid out what she knew and what she suspected and what she needed, and Cal listened with the focused attention of a man who had been waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for exactly this conversation. The fence breach, he said when she finished. I found it 6 weeks ago. East pasture near the ridge. I patched it and didn't think much of it. Fence gets damaged all the time in this kind of terrain. Evelyn looked at him. Has it come loose again? A pause. Twice? I repatched it both times. Did you tell Silas? Cal's expression shifted in the way of a man who had been making small decisions, not to trouble his employer with things that seemed small, and was now understanding that they weren't. No, he said. I thought it was just, the ground's hard, the posts don't set well, the cattle lean on it. I thought it was ordinary. It's not ordinary, she said gently. That breach is how they come in, or at least one of the ways. She looked toward the east, where the ridge threw a dark line against the darkening sky. I need you to leave it unpatched. Cal went very still. Leave it. And tell no one. He studied her face in the fading light. He was a man who had spent his life reading terrain and weather and the particular language of cattle, and he turned that same careful reading now on the woman standing beside him at the spring. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him. "All right," he said. "It's unpatched." She told Silas that same night, after the hands were in the bunkhouse and the main house was quiet. She spread her notebook on the desk between them and walked him through it. The fence breach, the delivery man's behavior, the pattern of timing she'd identified from the financial records, and the dates of the cattle's visible decline. She had cross-referenced 3 months of ledger entries against the delivery schedule and found that the worst downturns in the herd's condition occurred consistently in the 10-day window after each supply delivery. Not the drought, not the summer, not random misfortune. 10 days after every delivery, like clockwork, like something introduced and then left to do its work. Silas followed her reasoning with an intensity that reminded her, in some quiet corner of her mind, that this was a man who had built something real out of difficult ground. Whatever else the past 4 months had cost him, they hadn't taken his mind. "So they're coming in through the east fence," he said. "How often?" "Based on the timeline, I think once every 2 to 3 weeks, probably at night, probably within a day or two of the delivery, to add to what's already being introduced through the feed." She paused. "We've had 2 deliveries since I've been watching. The next one came in Thursday. If the pattern holds, they'll come through the fence within the next 3 nights. Silas was quiet for a long moment, looking at the map she'd drawn. "You want to set a watch?" "A quiet one. Just you and me." He looked up. "Not Cal?" "Cal has to behave normally. If someone on this ranch is feeding information back to Crow's people, and I think it's possible, though I can't prove it yet, then the fewer people who know about the watch, the better." The thought landed visibly. Silas's expression moved through something difficult. He had 12 men on this ranch, men he had chosen and worked alongside, and the suggestion that one of them might be a traitor was the kind of thing that changed how a room felt once it entered it. She watched him absorb it and decide not to argue with it. "Tonight?" he asked. "We start tonight," she said. "And we're patient. We don't move until we're certain." He nodded once. "I'll get the lanterns." "No lanterns," she said, "but we use the moonlight." The first night produced nothing but cold and silence, and the distant sound of coyotes communicating their indifference to human troubles. They took positions on opposite sides of the east fence line, close enough that a low whistle would carry between them, far enough apart to cover the most likely approach routes that Evelyn had identified from the terrain. The moon was 3/4 full and the sky was clear. The frontier offering, for once, exactly what she needed. She crouched in the shadow of a mesquite stand and watched the dark edge of the ridge. Nothing moved. After 4 hours, Silas gave the signal they'd agreed on, 2 low clicks, and they withdrew to the ranch. She was back in the kitchen before the first grey of dawn, the range lit, the bread going in, and nobody any the wiser. The second night was the same, cold, still, empty. On the second morning, Pete Dawson found her in the kitchen looking at her water samples again and asked, with the cheerful directness of youth, what she was doing. "Checking the water quality," she said. "For cooking?" "For everything," she said. "Water affects everything, Pete. The bread, the stew, the coffee. A cook needs to know her water." She handed him a cup of coffee made from the spring water she'd begun using for all the kitchen's needs after the first week. "Try that." He drank. His face changed. That's really good coffee. Better than usual." "Different water," she said simply. He looked at the cup with the expression of someone having a small revelation. "Huh." He drank the rest of it. "You know, Miss Hart, you notice things different than most people." "Everybody notices things," she said. "Most people just don't write them down." The third night, they went out again. It was the first night of September, the air carrying the first tentative suggestion that somewhere, eventually, the summer would concede. The moon had shifted and the shadows were different, and Evelyn repositioned herself slightly east of her previous spot, reading the terrain the way her mother had taught her to read a kitchen, looking for where the flow naturally went. She had been in position for perhaps 2 hours when she heard it. Not loud, almost nothing. Just a sound that didn't belong to the natural inventory of nighttime sounds she'd catalogued over 2 evenings of watching. A soft metallic sound, brief and then gone. The kind of sound a fence wire makes when it's being carefully manipulated rather than simply failing on its own. She stayed completely still. There was a long silence, then she heard footsteps. Careful, deliberate, the footsteps of someone who believed they were alone in a landscape that was used to being empty. 2 sets, she thought, moving in from the east. She gave the signal, 2 low clicks. 30 feet away, in the shadow of the fence line, Silas heard her and went still. The shapes came through the breach in the fence with the practiced ease of people who had done this before. 2 men, as she'd guessed. They moved toward the barn with a directness that confirmed they knew exactly where they were going and what they were there to do. No hesitation, no scouting. This was a routine. A well-established, completely confident routine. She watched them cross the yard. She watched them enter the barn. She looked across the fence line at the dark position where Silas was and made a decision in the space of a single breath. She moved. She crossed the open ground between the mesquite and the barn in a low, fast arc that kept her in the shadows as long as possible, moving with a speed and silence that would have surprised most of the people who had ever looked at her and made assumptions about what her body could and couldn't do. She reached the barn's side wall and pressed against it, listening. Inside, she could hear them moving, the scrape of the feed storage door, the soft sound of something being opened and measured. They were working with the efficiency of people who had done this specific task a dozen times and expected to do it a dozen more. Silas materialized at her shoulder so quietly that she almost startled. He had moved through the dark with the skill of a man who had spent his life on this land and knew every inch of it. He met her eyes and she saw in his face the same thing she felt. Not quite rage, not quite grief, but something that combined elements of both into something colder and more purposeful. She held up 2 fingers. He nodded. She held up 3 fingers, then counted them down. On the 3rd finger, Silas moved through the barn door with a speed that entirely contradicted the worn stillness she'd seen in him on her first day. And Evelyn came in behind him with the lantern she'd been carrying unlit, striking the match in the same motion as she came through the door. The light flooded the barn. The 2 men froze. Evelyn recognized the narrow-faced delivery man immediately. He was standing at the feed storage with a cloth bag in one hand and a glass vial in the other, and his face in the sudden lantern light went through a rapid sequence of expressions, surprise, calculation, the beginning of some excuse, that never completed because Silas had covered the distance between the door and the feed storage in 3 long strides, and had the narrow-faced man's collar in one fist before the calculation could produce anything useful. The 2nd man bolted for the door. He didn't reach it. Cal Reardon stepped out of the darkness just inside the entrance with the quiet solidity of a man who had been there the whole time. Evelyn looked at Cal. Cal looked at her with an expression that said plainly that he had made his own decision about what constituted normal behavior and had positioned himself accordingly, whatever she'd asked of him. She decided in that moment that she did not mind. "Hold the lantern up," Silas said. His voice was very controlled. The control was doing a great deal of work. She held it up. The narrow-faced man had stopped struggling. He was looking at Silas Boone with the specific expression of someone recalculating what they thought they knew, and what he saw in Silas's face apparently did not encourage him to continue resisting. The glass vial was still in his hand. Evelyn reached out and took it carefully, holding it up to the lantern light. The liquid inside was clear, odorless, she discovered when she carefully loosened the stopper, but the vial itself had a faint residue of the greyish substance she'd seen settling in her sample jars. Compounds that, introduced slowly into feed and water, would weaken cattle without killing them outright, creating a decline that looked like the cumulative effect of poor conditions rather than deliberate poisoning. "What's your name?" she asked the narrow-faced man in the same pleasant conversational tone she used when asking Pete Dawson if he wanted more coffee. He didn't answer. "Your name is in the Harrow Creek freight ledger," she said. "I've already written it down." She hadn't, but she was confident it was there. "What I don't have yet is the name of the person who hired you." The man looked at Silas. Silas looked back at him with an expression that communicated, without words, the complete range of what was going to happen to him if he chose to be unhelpful. "I don't know who hired us," the man said. His voice was younger than his face, yes, younger and considerably more frightened. "We deal with a man named Aldous. He's the one who told us what to do and paid us." "Aldous?" Evelyn said. She didn't know the name yet, but she wrote it in her notebook while Cal held the 2nd man still and Silas kept his grip on the 1st. And who does Aldous work for? A silence, longer than the last one. I want your word that you'll let us go, the narrow-faced man said. I can offer you the sheriff's office instead of something considerably less formal, Evelyn said pleasantly, which is more than you've offered the families whose cattle you've been slowly killing. The man's face worked through something. The second man, held by Cal, had gone very still in the particular way of someone who has decided that cooperation is the most viable remaining option. Crow, the narrow-faced man finally said. The word came out small and hard, like a stone dropped into a well. Victor Crow runs Aldous. Aldous runs us. The barn was silent for a moment, except for the soft breathing of the horses in their stalls, who had observed the entire proceedings with the magnificent indifference of animals who have their own concerns. Silas let go of the man's collar. He stepped back and stood very still, and in the silence after the name was spoken, Evelyn could see him integrating this truth into the architecture of the past 4 months. The desperate accounts, the dying cattle, the almost signed papers, all of it rearranging itself around the single fact of Victor Crow's deliberate intention. She watched a man understand that his suffering had been manufactured, and she watched what that understanding did to him, and it was one of the harder things she'd witnessed in her life. Cal, Silas said, in a voice that had gone very quiet. Tie them up. We'll hold them until morning, and then we take them to the sheriff. Silas, Evelyn said it carefully. We need to think about the sheriff. He looked at her. She saw the question in his face. Crow has influence across this county, she said. If the sheriff is bought, or even simply cautious, these 2 men could be released before anything can be done, and Crow will know we've caught them, and he'll cover his tracks. Then what do you suggest? Silas asked. She looked at the vial in her hand. She looked at the 2 men, now being secured by Cal, with the economical expertise of a man who had tied things up his whole life. She looked at Silas, and at Cal, and at the barn around them. The barn that was part of a ranch that someone had been quietly killing for 4 months. I suggest, she said slowly, that we hold them here quietly for the next 36 hours, and that we use that time to make sure that when we do go public with what we know, we do it in front of an audience that Victor Crow cannot control and cannot dismiss. Silas looked at her for a long moment. A town gathering, he said. There's a county ranchers meeting in Harrow Creek on Saturday, she said. It was something she'd noted during her supply runs. A notice posted outside the general store, a gathering of all the ranching families in the county, including, she was almost certain, the families that Crow had already bought out. Merchants, ranchers, local officials, everyone in one room. The silence stretched long enough that she could hear the wind moving through the mesquite outside the barn. You want to take this to the whole county, Silas said, all at once. I want to take it somewhere he can't buy his way out of in advance, she said. I want to take it somewhere the truth can land before he has time to shape the story. She looked at him steadily. We have the vials. We have the feed samples I've been collecting. We have the ledgers and the water records and 2 men who have already said his name. And I have, she tapped the notebook, 36 hours to make sure that when we walk into that meeting room, there is not a single question we cannot answer. Silas Boone looked at Evelyn Hart across the lantern-lit barn, across the 2 bound men and the evidence and the long, hard road that had led to this specific moment, and in his face she saw something that hadn't been there on the day she'd walked through the black iron gate. Not hope exactly, because hope was still too fragile for a man who had spent 4 months losing. Something more solid than hope. Something that looked like it intended to stay. 36 hours, he said. 36 hours, she confirmed. Cal tied the last knot and straightened and looked between the 2 of them. Somebody want to tell me what's happening Saturday? He asked. Evelyn picked up the lantern and turned toward the barn door, toward the ranch and the kitchen and the 36 hours of work that waited for her. The night air was cool against her face when she stepped outside. The first genuinely cool air she'd felt since she'd arrived. A small mercy from a sky that had been merciless for months. Saturday, she said. We end this. The 36 hours that followed were the longest of Evelyn's life, and also, in some way she would only understand later, the most clarifying. She didn't sleep. There wasn't time. And even if there had been, her mind wouldn't have permitted it. It was running at a pace that sleep would have interrupted the way a sudden noise interrupts a calculation, breaking the thread of something that needed to stay continuous. She worked through the night in the kitchen, but the work she was doing had nothing to do with food. She spread everything across the kitchen table. The notebooks, the water samples in their glass jars, the vial taken from the narrow-faced man, the feed samples she'd been quietly collecting since her 3rd week on the ranch, and 6 months of financial ledgers that she'd asked Silas to bring from the office. She arranged it all with the same methodical attention she'd have given to a complicated meal that required precise timing, every element in its place, every sequence considered, nothing left to chance. Cal appeared at the kitchen door at 4 a.m. with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of a man who has decided that sleep is something that happens to other people. He set 1 cup beside her without a word and looked at the spread across the table. "Tell me what you need," he said. "Sit down," she said. "I need you to go through the financial ledgers with me. You've been on this ranch longer than anyone. I need you to mark every entry that struck you as wrong, even if you couldn't explain why at the time." He sat. They worked until the sky outside the kitchen window began its slow transition from black to the dark blue that preceded dawn. And by the time Pete Dawson appeared in the doorway at 5:30 expecting breakfast, they had marked 47 entries across 6 months of records that formed a pattern of financial hemorrhage too specific and too consistent to be attributed to drought, mismanagement, or ordinary bad luck. "Miss Hart," Pete said, looking at the table with the wide-eyed expression of a young man encountering something significantly outside his expectations for a Saturday morning. "What?" "Sit down, Pete," she said. "Eat something. And then I need to tell you something important." She told him enough. Not everything, but enough. She watched his young face move through disbelief and then anger and then a kind of fierce, uncomplicated resolve that made her think he was going to be all right in this world, eventually, when it had finished testing him. "Crow," he said with the particular contempt of someone hearing a truth that recontextualizes everything they've been watching without understanding. "All this time, it was Crow." "We believe so," she said. "And today we're going to prove it." Silas came in at 6 with the look of a man who had also not slept, though his version of not sleeping looked different from hers. Where she had spent the night in productive motion, he had clearly spent it in the specific stillness of someone making decisions that couldn't be unmade. He poured himself coffee, looked at the table, looked at her. "How are we doing?" he asked. "We're ready," she said. And then, because she believed in honest accounting and he deserved it, "We're close to ready. I need 2 more hours." He nodded and left her to it. The county ranchers' meeting was held in the Harrow Creek Town Hall, a building that served as gathering place, courtroom, and occasional church, depending on what the community needed from it on any given day. It was larger than most of the other buildings in town, with high ceilings and long wooden benches that could accommodate most of the county's population if everyone was willing to sit close together, which on a Saturday in September they generally were. Evelyn had never been inside it, but she'd walked past it on every supply run, and she'd noted its position relative to the general store, the freight office, and the bank. 3 buildings that, she now understood, all had connections to Victor Crow's expanding web of influence. They arrived early. She had asked Silas to bring the wagon rather than ride, because she had things to carry, and those things needed to arrive intact and organized. She rode in the bench seat beside him with her satchel on her lap and the recipe book, as always, pressed against her side. Inside the recipe book was the new notebook. Inside the satchel were the jars, the vial, the marked ledgers, and a document she had spent the final hour of the night writing out in her clearest hand. A precise chronological account of every piece of evidence she had gathered, laid out not as a story but as a record, the way a surveyor lays out land, fact by fact, date by date, measurement by measurement. Cal rode behind the wagon. Pete rode beside him. They had not discussed strategy on the road. There was nothing left to discuss. The strategy was complete. What remained now was the doing of it. The town hall was already filling when they arrived. Ranchers from across the county, some of whom Evelyn recognized from her supply runs. Others who were strangers to her but who carried the particular weathered quality of people who spent their lives working difficult land in difficult conditions. Merchants from Harrow Creek. A circuit judge named Harlan Motes, who happened to be in town this week, something Evelyn had confirmed with Mrs. Aldrin 2 days earlier, and had arranged the timing around with deliberate precision. The county sheriff, a heavy-set man named Briggs, who had the watchful eyes of someone accustomed to reading rooms for trouble, and Victor Crow, already present when they arrived, standing near the front of the room with two of his men and a smile that occupied his face with the serene confidence of a man who has never, not once in his life, walked into a room expecting anything other than to be in control of it. He saw Silas first. His expression adjusted slightly, a small recalibration, a faint increase in the warmth of the smile, the social reflex of a man who has built an empire on the management of impressions. Then his gaze moved to Evelyn, and something very different happened in his eyes. Not alarm yet. Something more preliminary than alarm. A question, a brief and quickly suppressed flicker of the question. Evelyn met his gaze for exactly 1 second and then looked away, because she had learned long ago that the most powerful thing you could do with a man who expected your attention was to deny it to him at the moment he most wanted it. She found a seat near the back and arranged her materials on the bench beside her, and she waited. The meeting opened with ordinary business, drought relief discussions, road maintenance, a disputed boundary between two properties in the northern part of the county. Evelyn sat with her hands folded and listened with apparent attentiveness, and let it all proceed the way it was going to proceed, because the timing needed to be right. Not too early, when the room was still settling. Not too late, when attention had peaked and begun to decline. She had identified the moment she was looking for, the point in the agenda when the floor was opened for general community concerns, when any member of the county could stand and speak. She had confirmed this with Mrs. Aldrin during the Thursday supply run, adding it to the growing list of things she owed that perceptive woman for. Victor Crow spoke during the drought relief discussion. Of course he did. He spoke about the hardship facing ranching families with such evident sympathy and such specific generosity that Evelyn watched several people in the room visibly relax in the presence of his concern. He had a gift for it. She acknowledged that to herself without admiration, the way you acknowledge the efficiency of something designed to cause harm. He was very good at the performance of caring about things he was actively destroying. He mentioned, with what appeared to be reluctant candor, that he had acquired several properties from ranching families over the past year. Terrible situations, he said. Families who'd come to the end of what they could sustain and needed a way out. He'd tried to offer fair value given the circumstances, though he acknowledged that market conditions in a drought year were what they were. He shook his head with the gravity of a man burdened by difficult realities. Beside Evelyn, she felt Silas go very still. When the floor opened for general concerns, she stood. She stood before she had consciously decided to stand, or perhaps she had decided and the decision had simply been ready, waiting for this moment the way a properly proofed dough was ready for the oven. She rose from the bench and she said, in a voice that was clear and even, and projected to the back of the hall the way her mother had taught her to project her voice when she was 12 years old, and her mother had said, "Evie, if you're going to say something worth saying, say it so the whole room can hear you. My name is Evelyn Hart. I cook at Blackthorn Ranch, and I would like to present this community with some information that I believe it deserves to have." The room shifted, the particular quality of attention changed, became less social, more focused. Heads turned. At the front of the room, she saw Victor Crow's smile settle into something that was still a smile in its physical arrangement, but had become entirely different in its content. Miss Hart. The man running the meeting, a ranch owner named Edgar Sims, looked at her with the polite uncertainty of a man encountering something outside his prepared agenda. "This is time for community concerns, not—" "This is a community concern," she said, still pleasantly, still clearly. "I would argue it is the most significant community concern in this county for the past 2 years, and I apologize for the disruption to your agenda, Mr. Sims, but I think that when you hear what I have to say, you'll understand why it couldn't wait for a scheduled presentation." A silence. Then Judge Harlan Motes, who was seated to the right of the main table, and who had been watching Evelyn with the sharp, measuring attention of a man accustomed to evaluating what people said in rooms like this, spoke. "Let her speak, Edgar," he said quietly. It was not a suggestion. Edgar Sims sat down. Evelyn walked to the front of the room. She carried the satchel with her and the recipe book, and she set them on the table at the front with the calm deliberateness of someone who has done exactly this before, even though she had never done anything like it in her life. She opened the satchel and arranged the materials as she had arranged them on the kitchen table, ordered, precise, each piece in the position she'd assigned it. Then she began. She did not tell the story dramatically. She had considered that approach and rejected it because she understood the difference between an audience that had come to be entertained and an audience that needed to be convinced. Drama could be dismissed. Evidence had to be engaged with. So she told it the way she had written it in the final hour of the night. Chronologically, factually, each claim supported immediately by the evidence that demonstrated it. She talked about the water. She held up the 3 jars and described the comparison. The clear spring water against the contaminated pump water. The visible sediment at the bottom of the trough samples. She produced the vial taken from the barn and described exactly how it had been obtained, by whom, from what position, at what time, and she set it beside the jars. She talked about the feed. She produced the grain samples she'd been collecting, labeled by date, and described the pattern of cattle deterioration that followed each delivery on a timeline too consistent to be coincidence. She told them about the narrow-faced man in the barn and his 40 seconds of alone time in the feed storage, and she read, from her notebook, the exact description of his appearance and behavior that she had recorded on the evening of the first supply delivery she'd witnessed. She talked about the finances. She opened the ledger to the first of the 47 marked entries and walked through the pattern. Not every entry, because the room didn't need every entry. It needed to understand the pattern. And she showed how the rate of financial deterioration at Blackthorn Ranch far exceeded what drought conditions could explain, and matched precisely with the timeline of the contamination and feed poisoning. She talked about the Henderson family and the Kwan brothers and the Peralta widow. She had spent part of the night writing to each of them with the express purpose of asking them to attend this meeting. Cal had ridden out with the letters Thursday evening, and when she reached their names, she turned and looked at the room. All 3 families were present. She had dared to hope for one. "I wrote to ask if you would come," she said, "because I believed that what happened to Blackthorn Ranch happened to you first, and I believed you deserved to hear this." She looked at the Henderson patriarch, a man with a face like dried creek bed, who had been watching her with an expression of such concentrated attention that it looked almost like pain. "Mr. Henderson, you're well? Did the water taste different in the months before you sold?" The room had gone completely quiet. Henderson looked at her. He looked at the jars on the table. His jaw worked once. "It did," he said. His voice came out rough, like something that hadn't been used in a while. "My wife said so. I thought she was imagining things." "She wasn't," Evelyn said. She turned back to the front of the room. Victor Crow had not moved. She gave him credit for that, for the composure he was maintaining, for the way his face had arranged itself into an expression of polite, concerned attention, as though he were simply a community member listening to a concerning presentation. His 2 men flanked him with the rigid stillness of people who have been told to stay still and are concentrating very hard on it. "Mr. Crow," she said. He raised his eyebrows with the mild surprise of a man being addressed unexpectedly. "I have here," she said, holding up the document she had written in the final hour of the night, "a record of payments made from an account held at First Territorial Bank, an account in the name of a man named Aldous Greer, who has worked as a contract agent for your Bar C Ranch for the past 3 years. To the 2 men who were apprehended on Blackthorn Ranch property in the early hours of Friday morning." She let that sit for exactly 1 breath. "Aldous Greer has also been identified by those 2 men and by documentation in the freight company ledgers as the person who coordinated the systematic contamination of water and feed supplies on at least 4 ranching properties in this county over the past 18 months. The room erupted, not all at once. It started at the edges and moved inward, the sound of people turning to each other, and the specific noise of many people processing the same information simultaneously and arriving at the same destination from different directions. Evelyn stood at the front of it and let it happen, because it needed to happen. Because this was the sound of a community encountering a truth that was going to change what the county looked like. "These are extraordinary accusations." Crow's voice cut through the noise with the practiced authority of a man who had never had trouble being heard in rooms. He was on his feet. She hadn't seen him stand, but there he was, and his composure was still remarkable, still in place, though something around the edges of it had shifted, made by a woman who has been on that ranch for less than 2 months, with samples and notebooks and vials that could have been prepared by anyone. That proved nothing about me. "They proved the poisoning," said Judge Motes from the right side of the table. His voice was mild and very precise. "Regardless of who directed it, the poisoning of a neighbor's livestock and water supply is a serious crime in this state, Mr. Crow. We can determine the chain of command as a subsequent matter. The bank records show the payment chain, Evelyn said over the noise of the room. I obtained them from a bank clerk who has been watching these transactions and had begun to have concerns of his own. She produced the final document from the satchel, the record she had spent a portion of Thursday afternoon acquiring in a conversation with a young bank clerk named Thomas Ellery, who had the nervous energy of a man who had been carrying something uncomfortable for longer than he wanted. Every payment from the Aldis Greer account to the men we have in custody at Blackthorn Ranch traces back through two intermediary accounts to a primary account controlled by Bar C Ranch, controlled ultimately by Victor Crow. Crow turned to his men. She saw it, the small, rapid exchange, the almost imperceptible shift in his posture that indicated a man switching from control to contingency. She had anticipated this too. She turned to the room and she said with the same clear, even projection, "Sheriff Briggs, I am requesting, formally and in front of this community and this circuit judge, that you detain Mr. Crow and his associates pending investigation. We have 2 witnesses in custody at Blackthorn Ranch who have already provided signed statements naming Crow as the architect of this scheme." She had gotten the signatures early Friday morning before anyone had ridden to town, while the 2 men were still in the specific state of cooperative exhaustion that followed a long night of being caught. Silas had witnessed both signatures. Cal had witnessed them too. Sheriff Briggs stood slowly. He was a man who moved carefully, she had observed. Not slow-witted, but deliberate. The kind of deliberate that came from understanding that the decisions of people in his position had weight and needed to be made with both eyes open. He looked at the documentation she had laid on the table. He looked at the judge. He looked at Victor Crow. And in that look, she could see the calculation. Not a corrupt calculation, she decided, but a careful one. A man who had respected Victor Crow's authority in this county for a long time, encountering the evidence that the authority had been built on manufactured ruin. "Mr. Crow," Briggs said, "I'm going to need you to come with me." The silence that followed was complete. Victor Crow looked around the room, at the ranchers, at the merchants, at the families he had bought out and the families he had been in the process of buying out, at the judge and the sheriff, and the 200 years of combined frontier stubbornness assembled on the wooden benches of the Harrow Creek Town Hall. He looked at all of it, and then he looked at Evelyn Hart, and in his expression she saw the moment the composure finally gave way. Not to rage, not to pleading, but to something she recognized despite never having seen it on his face before. He looked at her the way he had looked at her through the kitchen window on his first visit to Blackthorn. The calculating look. The look that had asked whether she was a problem. He had answered his own question too late. "You have no idea," he said, and his voice had lost its warmth entirely, stripped down to something that was more honest than anything he'd said in this room. What it took to build what I've built. "I have some idea," Evelyn said quietly. "That's why I'm standing here." Briggs put his hand on Crow's arm. One of Crow's men started forward and found Cal Reardon and Pete Dawson and 2 other Blackthorn hands already positioned between them and the exit, having moved into place at some point during the preceding 10 minutes with the quiet coordination of people who had been given a plan and trusted it. The room began to move, the controlled disruption of a community rearranging itself around a new truth. People were standing, talking. The Henderson patriarch was speaking to the Kwan brothers with an intensity that suggested the conversation had been waiting for years. Mrs. Aldrin caught Evelyn's eye across the room and gave her a single, slow nod that contained more than Evelyn had time to fully receive. Silas appeared beside her. He had been in the room the entire time, seated on the bench at the back where she'd left him, and she had known he was there the whole time, the way you know that solid ground is beneath you, even when you're focused on what's ahead. "It's done," she said. He looked at the front of the room, where Briggs was now speaking quietly to Crow, and then he looked at her, at Evelyn Hart, who had walked 3 miles in August heat to apply for a cook's position, and had ended by standing at the front of a crowded room and dismantling the largest land-grabbing scheme this county had ever produced, armed with nothing but 3 months of careful attention and a notebook kept inside a recipe book. "Evelyn," he said, just her name, the first time he had used it. She looked at him. He seemed to want to say something more and to be finding the words insufficient to the task, which she understood because the words were insufficient. What had happened in the past hour was not a thing that words arrived at easily. "Come on," she said. "Let's go home." They walked out of this Harrow Creek town hall into September air that was cooler than it had been, genuinely and unmistakably cooler. The first real intimation that the long, brutal summer was prepared, at last, to release its grip. The sky was very blue and very wide, and somewhere on the road back to Blackthorn, Evelyn looked up at it and felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph, which was too loud for what she felt, but something quieter. The particular satisfaction of a thing done completely, of every step taken and every detail attended to, of a problem understood and answered. She still had work to do. The work, if anything, was only beginning, but the shape of it had changed, and that, for now, was enough. The road back to Blackthorn Ranch felt different than any road Evelyn had travelled in her life. Not longer, not shorter. Different in the way that familiar paths become different after something in you is permanently shifted, so that the same dust and the same dry grass and the same cracked earth look like a place you are seeing clearly for the first time, rather than a place you are simply passing through. She was quiet on the wagon bench beside Silas, and he was quiet too, and the silence between them had changed its quality from the silences of their early weeks together. Those careful, measured distances that two people maintain when they are still deciding whether to trust each other. This silence was comfortable in the way of two people who have stood in the same fire and come out the other side and no longer need to explain themselves to each other. Cal and Pete rode behind them, and even their conversation, the low, occasional exchange of two men processing a significant morning, felt muted by the weight of what had happened. The sky stretched wide and blue and genuinely cool, and somewhere to the west, on the very edge of the horizon, a line of clouds had appeared that had not been there in the morning. Evelyn noticed them and said nothing, not wanting to make too much of it, not wanting to invite the particular disappointment that came from hoping for rain in a drought year. They arrived at Blackthorn to find the two captured men still secured in the barn under the watch of a hand named Duarte, who had been given minimal explanation and had accepted the responsibility with the stoic practicality of a man accustomed to being handed unusual situations and expected to manage them. Sheriff Briggs sent two deputies out from Harrow Creek by mid-afternoon to take them into formal custody, and Evelyn stood in the yard and watched them go, with the specific feeling of watching a chapter end. Not triumphantly, because the men themselves had been instruments rather than architects, but with the finality of a door closing on something that would not be opened again. The investigation that followed moved with the methodical momentum of legal processes engaging with well-documented wrongdoing. Judge Motes, who had remained in Harrow Creek an extra week past his scheduled departure, convened a formal inquiry within 4 days of the town meeting. Evelyn was called to present her evidence 3 times over the following 2 weeks, once to Motes, once to a territorial marshal who arrived from the east with the serious efficiency of a man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of documented case, and once to a panel of county officials who sat behind a long table and looked at her materials with the focused attention of people who understood that what was before them was not just one rancher's story, but a systematic unraveling of something that had touched every corner of their community. She presented her evidence the same way each time, clearly, chronologically, without embellishment, letting the documentation carry the weight she'd spent 3 months accumulating. The vial, the water samples, the grain records, the marked ledgers, the bank payment trail, the signed statements, the timeline that connected every element into a pattern that had only one reasonable explanation. Victor Crow maintained his composure through the early proceedings with an endurance that she grudgingly acknowledged. He had lawyers, 2 of them brought in from San Antonio, expensive and meticulous, who challenged every piece of evidence with the specific creativity of men being paid to find alternative explanations for things that did not have alternative explanations. They suggested the water contamination was geological. They suggested the financial records reflected ordinary drought losses. They suggested the payment trail was circumstantial and that Aldous Greer had acted without Crow's knowledge or direction. Aldous Greer himself settled that argument on the 3rd day of the formal inquiry, when he arrived at the proceeding having spent a week in a county jail cell reconsidering his loyalties and found them considerably diminished. He was a compact, grey-haired man with the careful bearing of someone who had spent years managing operations that required discretion, and when he sat before Judge Motes and the territorial marshal and began to speak, he spoke with the thoroughness of a man who had decided that the only remaining asset he possessed was the truth and intended to spend it completely. He described 3 years of systematic operation. The identification of target properties, ranches with valuable land, sufficient water rights, and owners who lacked the resources or connections to withstand sustained pressure. The coordination of the contamination scheme through the freight company, whose route access to target properties Crowe had arranged specifically for this purpose. The gradual financial strangulation through manipulated supply chains and a bank that, under Crowe's influence, had quietly tightened credit for affected ranchers at precisely the moments when they most needed flexibility. The management of the previous cooks at Blackthorn, not physical harm, Greer was careful to specify, but deliberate unsettling, small invasions and disturbances designed to make the position uncomfortable until it was vacated. The room was very still while he spoke. Evelyn sat in the gallery and listened and wrote nothing because everything Greer was saying was documentation she had already assembled, and hearing it confirmed aloud by the man who had executed it produced in her not satisfaction exactly, but something that felt like the particular relief of a tension that has been maintained for a long time finally being allowed to release. Victor Crowe was convicted on 7 counts of fraud, criminal conspiracy, and deliberate destruction of property. The sentence, delivered by Judge Motes in the Harrow Creek Courthouse on a Thursday morning in late October, was 15 years. The Bar C Ranch, along with Crowe's interests in the freight company and the bank, was placed under the administration of the Territorial Court, pending the settlement of civil claims from the affected ranching families. The Henderson family was the first to have their land formally returned. Evelyn was present for that, standing at the back of the courthouse with Cal and Pete and Silas, when Edgar Henderson, the man with the face like dried creek bed who had confirmed, in the town hall, that his wife had been right about the water, received the deed back to his property and held it with both hands and did not say anything for a long moment. His wife, seated beside him, put her hand over his and also said nothing, and the silence they shared was not the silence of people with nothing to say, but the silence of people for whom words were simply not the right instrument for the moment. The Kwan brothers followed a week later. The Peralta widows case required more time, because Crowe's lawyers had structured that particular acquisition with additional legal complexity, but by December, the Territorial Court had unwound it sufficiently to begin the process of restoration. 3 other ranching families came forward during the investigation with evidence of suspicious losses that matched Crowe's pattern, properties he had been in the process of targeting but had not yet brought to the point of purchase. The inquiry expanded to cover their situations as well, and the picture that emerged over the months of the formal investigation was of an operation far larger and more deliberate than even Evelyn had fully understood when she'd stood at the front of the town hall with her 3 glass jars and her marked ledgers. Through all of it, she cooked. She rose before dawn and lit the range and fed the 12 men of Blackthorn Ranch 3 times a day. And she maintained the kitchen with the same methodical care she'd brought to it from the first day. But the kitchen itself was different now. Not in its physical arrangement, which had been established in the first week and had proven its logic, but in its atmosphere. The hands ate differently than they had in September. There was a quality to their presence at the table that had not been there before. Something easier, less guarded, the particular looseness of people who have stopped bracing for the next blow, because the threat that produced the bracing has been removed. Pete Dawson started arriving in the kitchen before breakfast. Not because he was needed, but because he had discovered that the kitchen before dawn was a good place to think, and Evelyn had discovered that he was useful company at an hour when most people were still negotiating with consciousness. They developed a routine without discussing it. He made the coffee while she started the bread, and they talked about whatever presented itself, which ranged from the progress of the investigation to Pete's family in Louisiana, to the behavior of a particular steer that had been causing Cal disproportionate frustration. "Miss Hart," Pete said one morning in October, standing at the range with the coffee pot, "do you think the ranch is going to be all right? Really all right, I mean. Not just legally." She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she thought about things. "The land's sound," she said. "The water's been clean since we switched to the spring supply. The cattle that made it through are recovering. Cal says the weight's coming back faster than he expected." She kneaded the bread dough with the rhythmic focus of someone performing a task that required presence. "The finances will take time. The drought's still the drought, but yes," she said, "I think it's going to be all right." "Because of you?" Pete said. She looked up. "Because of everyone who stayed," she said, "including you." He looked into his coffee cup with the expression of someone receiving a compliment they weren't sure how to hold. "I almost didn't," he said quietly. "After the 4th month of things getting worse, I was thinking about moving on. Thought maybe the ranch was just done." He glanced up. "Then you came and made that stew the first night, and I thought, well, maybe I'll give it one more week." Evelyn laughed, a real laugh, the kind that arrived without being prepared for. "I'm glad my stew was persuasive," she said. "It was exceptional stew," he said seriously, and the seriousness of it made her laugh again. The rains came in November. Not the tentative, apologetic drizzle that drought country sometimes produced, as though testing whether precipitation was still welcome, but real rain, sustained and generous, the kind that turned the cracked earth dark and filled the dry creek beds, and released from the grass and the soil a smell that was so essentially itself, so precisely the smell of things returning to life, that when Evelyn stepped out onto the kitchen porch the morning it started and stood in it, she felt something move through her that had no precise name. She stood there for a long time. The rain came down on the roof and on the yard and on the ridge in the distance, and somewhere in the pasture she could hear cattle moving, and closer, the particular sound of someone crossing the yard in the rain without hurrying. Silas stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He was already wet. He'd been out at the east pasture when the rain started, she guessed, and he stood in it with the expression of a man for whom the rain was arriving not just as weather, but as something that required a moment of its own. He looked up at her on the porch. She looked down at him in the rain. "It's raining," she said. "It is," he agreed. There was a pause that held several things in it simultaneously. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." He came up the porch steps and through the kitchen door, and she made the coffee with the spring water that she would eventually replace with the well water, once it had been thoroughly flushed and tested. The well itself had been cleaned and sealed and tested by a man Cal knew from a town 3 counties over who understood water systems, and his assessment was that within 3 months it would be clean and safe. She had written his method and findings in the new section she'd added to the second notebook, which had evolved over the months from an evidence log into something more like a record of the ranch's recovery, dates and observations and small victories catalogued with the same care she'd applied to the investigation. She set the coffee on the table and sat across from him, and they drank it while the rain hit the kitchen window with the steady sound of something that intended to stay a while. "Martha Whitmore asked me last week," she said, "if I would be willing to talk to some of the women in town, the wives and daughters of the ranching families. About what I did, I suppose, how I thought about things." Silas looked at her over his cup. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I'd think about it." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "I've been thinking about it. And I think I'd like to," she said. "I think there are things worth passing on. Not just investigation methods." She smiled slightly at the phrase. "But the way of looking at things. The habit of writing things down. The understanding that noticing something and doing nothing with it is a kind of waste." She paused. "My mother taught me to cook, and I've been grateful for that my entire life. Not just because I've been able to feed myself, but because cooking taught me to pay attention, to understand systems, to know that every element in a process affects every other element." She looked at the rain on the window. "I'd like to pass something like that along." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You should do it." "I intend to," she said. He smiled at that, a real smile, not the almost smile she'd catalogued from the early weeks, but a complete one, arriving without apology. It changed his face considerably, and she noted this in the way she noted everything, which was to say, quietly and permanently. They sat in the kitchen with the rain coming down outside, and the ranch around them was alive in a way it hadn't been since Evelyn had arrived, alive not despite what it had been through, but partly because of it, in the way that things which have been tested and have held are more truly themselves than things which have never been asked to prove what they're made of. The weeks that followed carried their own particular rhythm, different from the urgent rhythm of the investigation and different again from the grim holding pattern of the months before. The land responded to the rain with the extravagant generosity of things that have been waiting. The grass came back in the pastures, the creek beds filled, the cattle filled out in ways that Cal tracked with the quiet satisfaction of a man watching something he'd been tending come right at last. The well was declared clean in December, as predicted, and Evelyn ran water from it and tasted it and found it clear and mineral in the natural, honest way of water that belongs to the ground it comes from. The Henderson family sent a letter in early December. It was addressed to Evelyn, not to Silas, which was a distinction she noticed and appreciated. Edgar Henderson wrote in the careful hand of a man for whom writing was effortful and therefore used only for things that mattered, and what he wrote was not elaborate, simply that his family was back on their land, and that his wife, whose name was Clara, had replanted the kitchen garden she'd been forced to abandon when they sold, and that the first thing to come up was time. He thought she might want to know that. She read it twice, standing at the kitchen window in the morning light, and then she put it inside the recipe book, between 2 pages of her mother's handwriting, where it would keep. She began her sessions with the women of Harrow Creek in January, on Sunday afternoons in the back room of Whitmore's General Store, which Martha Whitmore made available with the decisive efficiency of a woman who had decided something was going to happen and was simply ensuring the logistics cooperated. The first Sunday, there were 7 women. The second Sunday, 11. By the end of February, she was turning chairs sideways to fit everyone in, and she had started a waiting list for the following month. She didn't teach them investigation methods exactly, though some of what she shared was applicable to that. She taught them what she knew: the systematic attention to detail, the importance of documentation, the understanding of how patterns across different domains connected into pictures that individual details couldn't produce alone. She taught them the principle her mother had articulated across a kitchen table in Beaumont 20 years earlier. Pay attention to what doesn't fit, Evie, because things that don't fit are trying to tell you something. She taught them to read ledgers and water and weather and contracts and the behavior of people who believed they weren't being watched. She taught them, in other words, to be the kind of woman that a county-wide fraud scheme had not anticipated and had fatally failed to account for. Mrs. Aldrin attended every session. She sat in the front row with the focused attention of a student who had already been practicing on her own for years and was grateful to finally have a framework for it. At the end of the 3rd session, she stopped Evelyn by the door and said, with the directness of a woman who had no patience for circumlocution, "You changed this county, Miss Hart. I want you to know someone understands that." Evelyn received this the way she received most things, quietly, completely. "The county changed itself," she said. I just showed it where to look." The harvest came with the end of winter, earlier than anyone expected, and better than anyone had dared to plan for. And on the first warm Saturday of the new season, the Blackthorn Ranch hands gathered at the long table in the yard for a meal that Evelyn had spent 2 days preparing. Not because the occasion demanded ceremony, but because after the year they had all been through, she wanted to feed these people with the full extent of what she knew how to do. It was the kind of meal that existed outside ordinary time. The kind that people remembered not just as food, but as a moment, a marker, a before and after. She had used the spring lamb Cal had set aside, and the first vegetables from the kitchen garden she'd planted in October, and bread from grain that was clean and whole and honestly delivered. And she had cooked it all with the focused joy of someone doing the thing they were made to do, in circumstances that made the doing of it mean something. Silas found her afterward when the table was being cleared and the hands were moving into the comfortable looseness of a long good meal, standing at the edge of the yard looking out at the pasture in the late afternoon light. The grass was green in a way that still seemed almost improbable, the specific, generous green of land that has been given back its water after a long time without. He stood beside her and they looked at it together for a moment. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a beat, and she recognized this as the particular silence of a man assembling language for something that didn't come easily to him. She waited because she had learned by now that what Silas Boone said when he was finally ready to say it was worth waiting for. "When I hired you," he started, "I told myself I was giving you a chance." "You were," she said. "I was wrong about the direction," he said. "It was the other way around." He turned to look at her, and his face in the late light had the particular honesty of a face that has stopped managing its expressions. "You gave this place a chance. You gave me one." He paused. "I'd like you to stay. Not as the cook, though you're the finest cook I've ever encountered, and I want to be clear that I'm aware of how significant a loss that represents." Something moved across his face that was both earnest and slightly self-aware, and she found that she loved that about him. The way the gravity and the almost humor coexisted. "I want you to stay, because this ranch is more itself with you in it than it ever was before you arrived, because I am more myself." He held her gaze. "I'm asking you to stay as my wife, Evelyn, as the person who stands with me on this land for whatever comes next." The pasture was very green and very quiet. The late sun laid long shadows across the grass. Somewhere behind them, from the yard, she could hear Cal saying something to Pete that made Pete laugh. That young, unguarded laugh of a man who hasn't had enough taken from him yet to change the way he moves through the world. She thought of the road she had walked in August heat with a recipe book and a satchel and $17 and the stubborn conviction that she was worth something. She thought of the broken wagon wheel and the Harrow Creek General Store and Martha Whitmore's biscuit wrapped in cloth. She thought of 3 glass jars on a windowsill and a notebook filled with small, careful observations, and a room full of people hearing the truth for the first time, and the specific look on Edgar Henderson's face when he held the deed to his own land with both hands and could not speak. She thought of all the roads she had traveled before this one, the logging camps and the steamboat and the boarding house, all the places she had fed people and moved on from, places that had needed what she offered but had never needed her. She looked at Silas Boone, standing in the late light of a recovering ranch on ground that was green again, and she understood with the same quiet certainty with which she understood everything that mattered, that this was the answer to a question she hadn't known how to ask. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath, just one, controlled, but she heard the weight in it, the thing it had been holding. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him. And they stood together at the edge of the yard, looking out at the green pasture and the ridge and the wide and generously clouded sky. And the ranch around them was alive and whole and genuinely, lastingly theirs. She still had the recipe book. She would always have the recipe book, her mother's handwriting, pressed between the covers alongside her own additions, alongside the letter from Edgar Henderson about his wife's time, alongside the notes from 36 hours of preparation that had changed the shape of a county. The book was heavier now than it had been on the road in August, not from anything physical, but from everything it had accumulated, everything she had pressed into it, everything she had carried through it. She would pass it on someday, she knew that already, to some woman who needed what she had needed, not a recipe for surviving, but a way of paying attention to the world precise enough to change it. But that was a future that would take care of itself. The present was this: a green pasture after a long drought, a man beside her who had learned to say her name like it meant something, a kitchen still warm from the best meal she had ever made, and a home, finally, completely, irreversibly, that was hers.